not. My videos are fact-based, made for curious minds and knowledge lovers. If you spot any mistakes, please comment. It helps me improve and keeps the facts accurate. Some may love cinematic visuals, but my focus is purely educational and informative. Don't forget to subscribe my channel and hit the bell icon. It's November 14, 1942. In the hellish, iron-choked waters of the Pacific, the USS South Dakota is fighting for its life. It's a floating inferno, trapped in the searchlights of an entire Japanese fleet. Without warning, shells begin ripping through the ship's superstructure, one after another, in a relentless, deafening barrage. A gunner's mate on a 40mm anti-aircraft gun is blasted by an explosion, thrown down 3 flights of stairs. He's wounded, bleeding, his jaw shattered, but he pulls himself back to his feet. For the rest of the night, under constant fire, he ignores his own pain. He pulls his wounded crewmates from the wreckage, and even fashions tourniquets from the belts of the dead to save the living. For his incredible bravery, he would later be awarded the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart. That gunner's mate was Calvin Leon Graham. And he was only 12 years old. This is the unbelievable, true story of how a boy who still had his baby teeth lied his way into the US Navy, became a World War II hero, and then faced a shocking betrayal that would take him nearly a lifetime to overcome. A desperate escape. So, how does a 12-year-old boy end up in the fiery crucible of a naval battle? To get that, you have to understand the world he was trying to escape. Calvin Graham was born in Canton, Texas, on April 3, 1930, one of 7 children in a poor farming family. His young life was defined by hardship. After his father died, his mother remarried, and his home became unbearable under an abusive stepfather. By age 11, things were so bad that Calvin and one of his older brothers just left, moving into a cheap rooming house to fend for themselves. Imagine that for a moment. An 11-year-old, basically on his own, trying to survive. Calvin was forced to grow up at a dizzying speed. He supported himself by selling newspapers and delivering telegrams, hustling for every nickel. His mother, who worked as a hotel maid, would visit occasionally, sometimes just to sign his report cards. But for all intents and purposes, Calvin was navigating the world alone. This solitary life, however, gave him a front-row seat to the storm gathering across the globe. Selling papers meant he was immersed in the headlines of the day, tracking the grim progress of the war in Europe and the Pacific. He developed a special hatred for Adolf Hitler, later telling a reporter that the dictator reminded him of his abusive stepfather. Then, in December 1941, the news of Pearl Harbor electrified the nation. For many, it was a call to arms. For Calvin Graham, it was something more. Some of his cousins had already been killed in combat, and a fire was lit inside him, a burning desire for justice, for payback, and maybe most of all, for escape. At an age when most boys were busy with school and games, Calvin made a life-altering decision. He was going to join the Navy. The only problem was, he was 11 years old. The great deception for a boy who stood just 5'2" and weighed a measly 125 pounds, joining the military seemed like pure fantasy. The minimum enlistment age was 17, or 16 with your parents' permission. But Calvin was nothing if not determined. His plan was bold, a full-on assault on the truth. First, he started shaving, hoping to force a few whiskers out of his preteen face to look older. It didn't work, but it was a start. He practiced deepening his voice, trying to iron out the boyish cracks and sound like a man. The real hurdle, though, was the paperwork. He and a few friends, who were only 15 and 16 themselves, cooked up a scheme. Calvin forged his mother's signature on the enlistment forms. But the signature needed to be notarized. In a stroke of cunning that bordered on genius, the boys learned that a local innkeeper kept a notary stamp at his front desk. They reported a fake fire on an upper floor, and while the manager rushed to investigate, they snatched the stamp, pressed it onto the forged document, and sealed the deal. Dressed in his older brother's suit to look bigger, Calvin told his mom he was going away to visit relatives. Instead, on August 15, 1942, he stood in line at the naval recruiting station in Houston, Texas. He'd passed the first hurdles, but he knew the biggest obstacle was yet to come, the dental exam. He later recalled his anxiety, saying, "I knew he'd know how young I was by my teeth. And the dentist did." He took one look in Calvin's mouth and saw the undeniable evidence of childhood, baby teeth. "You're 12, he said, "get out of here." This was the moment of truth. A lesser person might have crumbled, but Calvin's desperation had forged a will of steel. Thinking fast, he played his only card. He pointed out that the dentist had already passed the boys in front of him, who Calvin knew were only 14 and 15. He laid down a bold threat: "If you don't pass me also, I'll go to your superior." In the mad rush to build up forces after Pearl Harbor, the Navy was desperate for every body it could get. The flustered dentist, faced with a boy with unnerving confidence, caved. He waved him through. And just like that, Calvin Leon Graham, at 12 years, 4 months, and 12 days old, was sworn into the United States Navy. He was officially a sailor. The escape was complete. But he had just traded one harsh reality for another, far more dangerous one. From boy to sailor, boot camp and Battleship X, Calvin was shipped off to recruit training in San Diego for 6 weeks of grueling transformation. If he thought his age would earn him any sympathy, he was dead wrong. The drill instructors, all hardened veterans, could easily spot the underage recruits. According to Graham, they didn't take pity on them. They did the opposite, punishing them for their youth by making them run extra miles and carry heavier packs. It was a brutal welcome, meant to weed out the weak. But Calvin had endured hardship his whole life. He gritted his teeth, pushed through, and successfully finished boot camp. From there, he was sent to Pearl Harbor and assigned to a brand new warship, the USS South Dakota. Commissioned just months earlier, the South Dakota was a state-of-the-art battleship, a 35,000-ton behemoth armed with 9 massive 16-inch guns and a forest of anti-aircraft weapons. With a crew of over 2,300 men, it was a floating city. And somewhere among them was a 12-year-old boy from Texas, trained as a loader for a 40mm anti-aircraft gun. In August 1942, the South Dakota steamed out of Philadelphia and headed for the war zone. It sailed through the Panama Canal and into the vast Pacific. Disaster struck early when the ship hit an uncharted coral reef, tearing a gash in its hull. After emergency repairs, the battleship was rushed to Pearl Harbor, where it was patched up and fitted with even more anti-aircraft guns. The urgency was obvious. The fight for Guadalcanal was raging, and every available warship was needed at the front. By mid-October, the South Dakota was ready. It joined Task Force 16, sailing alongside the legendary aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. Calvin Graham's first taste of combat came on October 26, 1942, at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. The Japanese launched a massive aerial assault, and the South Dakota's gunners were unleashed. The sky filled with smoke and fire as the ship's guns roared, defending the priceless Enterprise. In the chaos, the South Dakota was credited with shooting down 26 enemy planes, earning a reputation for being quick on the trigger. Calvin, now a battle-tested gunner, had proven he could handle the heat. But Santa Cruz was just a warm-up. A far more terrible ordeal was waiting for him in the dark waters off Guadalcanal, a place that would soon be known as Iron Bottom Sound. Trial by fire, the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal the night of November 14, 1942, was pitch black. The USS South Dakota, along with the battleship USS Washington and 4 destroyers, was part of Task Force 64. Their mission was desperate: to intercept a powerful Japanese naval force steaming down the slot, to deliver a final, crushing blow to the U.S. Marines clinging to Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Around 11:30 p.m., the enemy was spotted. Shortly after, all hell broke loose. In the confusion, a short circuit plunged the South Dakota into darkness. An overload knocked out power to the ship's rear section, silencing her main radar and fire control systems. The mighty battleship was suddenly blind and mute. Just as the crew scrambled to restore power, the Japanese force, led by the battleship Kirishima, found her. The South Dakota was caught, lit up by enemy searchlights, and became the sole target of an entire Japanese fleet. At near point-blank range, the shelling began. In just a few horrifying minutes, the ship was savaged, struck by at least 26 major caliber shells. The superstructure was shredded. Fires erupted. Communications were destroyed. 40 men were killed and another 180 were wounded. Calvin Graham was at his station, manning his 40mm gun, when his world exploded. Shrapnel tore through his face, ripping into his jaw and mouth and knocking out his front teeth. Before he could even register the pain, the impact from another shell threw him violently down 3 levels of the superstructure. He was burned, bleeding, and in shock, but he was alive. What happened next is the very definition of heroism. Though seriously wounded himself, the 12-year-old gunner got back up. Amid the chaos, the screams, and the constant roar of battle, he saw a job that needed to be done. For the rest of that horrific night, Calvin became a rescuer. He moved through the wreckage, pulling his injured shipmates to safety. He later recalled, "I took belts off the dead and made tourniquets for the living and gave them cigarettes and encouraged them all night." He was just a boy, yet in that dark moment, he acted with the courage of a seasoned veteran. He comforted the dying and saved the wounded, refusing to complain about his own injuries because, as he put it, so many were dead. The South Dakota, miraculously, survived. The Japanese, thinking they had sunk the American battleship, eventually withdrew. The battered ship, which the press would nickname Battleship X, to hide the fact she was still afloat, limped back to the Brooklyn Navy Yard for massive repairs. For his extraordinary bravery, Calvin Graham was awarded the Bronze Star Medal for Valor and the Purple Heart for his wounds. He had turned 13 while serving on the ship. He was a decorated American war hero. But his ordeal was far from over. The kind of bravery Calvin showed is almost impossible to imagine. If you find these hidden stories of history as compelling as we do, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You won't want to miss the incredible tales we have coming up. The hero's fall, discovery and disgrace. When the battered USS South Dakota returned to the States, newsreel cameras were there to capture the arrival of the heroic Battleship X. For the crew, it was a moment of pride. For Calvin Graham, it was the beginning of the end. Back in his hometown, his mother went to the local theater and saw the newsreel. In the crowd of sailors on deck, she spotted an impossibly young face. "That's my son," she exclaimed. She promptly wrote to the Navy, telling them her son's real age. The news came at the worst possible time for Calvin. He had gone to Texas for his grandmother's funeral, arriving a day late, and had done so without official permission. The same military bureaucracy that had been so willing to look the other way when it needed bodies now came down on him with its full, unforgiving weight. He was no longer a hero, he was a problem. Calvin Graham was arrested for lying about his age. The boy who had faced down a Japanese fleet was thrown into a naval brig in Corpus Christi, Texas, and held for nearly 3 months. The conditions were brutal. He wasn't treated as a wounded veteran, but as a delinquent. The Navy only released him when his sister, furious at his treatment, threatened to go to the newspapers and expose the story of the baby vet being held in a military prison. His release wasn't an act of mercy. On April 1, 1943, just 2 days before his 13th birthday, Calvin Graham was given a dishonorable discharge from the U.S. Navy. In one cold, bureaucratic move, his service was erased. The Navy stripped him of his medals, the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart, and revoked his disability benefits for the injuries he sustained in combat. He was denied his back pay and even travel money to get home. The hero of Guadalcanal was sent packing in disgrace. He returned home to a brief bit of celebrity, but the fame quickly faded. He was a 13-year-old war veteran with no medals, no benefits, and a dishonorable discharge that would haunt him for decades. A lost youth, life after the Navy. The world Calvin Graham returned to was one he no longer fit in. He'd left as a boy and come back a man, aged not by years but by the horrors he'd seen. He tried to go back to school, but it was impossible. How could he sit in a classroom with other 13-year-olds after what he'd been through? He couldn't keep up and quickly dropped out. His life became a whirlwind of adult responsibilities he was far too young for. At the tender age of 14, he got married. A year later, at 15, he was a father. To support his new family, he worked as a welder in a Houston shipyard, a tough job for a boy who was still growing. But this new life was just as unstable as his old one. By age 17, the baby vet was already divorced. He was a high school dropout, a father, and a veteran with no official record to show for it. In a strange twist of fate, in 1948, the draft came calling. Rather than be drafted into the army, Calvin, still only 17, decided to enlist again, this time legally. He joined the U.S. Marine Corps. It was a chance to serve honorably, to maybe find the structure and purpose he'd lost. He served for 3 years, reaching the rank of corporal. But his military career was again cut short. In 1951, while on active duty, he fell from a pier and broke his back, an injury that ended his time in the Marines. Though his honorable service in the Marines finally made him a veteran in the eyes of the government, he only received a small disability for his back injury. The serious combat wounds from his Navy days, the shrapnel damage to his face and jaw, were not recognized, and they plagued him as he got older. After his second discharge, he was back in the civilian world, struggling to get by, often selling magazine subscriptions for a living. The boy hero had become a man haunted by his past, fighting for a future that always seemed just out of reach. His longest battle was only just beginning. The long fight for honor for decades, Calvin Graham lived in a bureaucratic nightmare. He was a man who had bled for his country but had no official recognition for it. The dishonorable discharge was a black mark that blocked him from getting the medical care and disability benefits he desperately needed for his lingering World War II injuries. Time and again, his requests to have his service recognized were denied. The Navy's stance was firm. His enlistment had been illegal from the start. As the years wore on, the injustice ate at him. The turning point came in the late 1970s. When President Jimmy Carter, a former Navy man himself, announced a discharge program for Vietnam War deserters, Graham saw a flicker of hope. He began writing letters to the White House and Congress, arguing his case with simple, powerful logic. He said, "I figure I damn sure deserve more than they did." His plea found sympathetic ears. 2 Texas senators, Lloyd Bentsen and John Tower, took up his cause in Washington. Finally, in 1978, President Carter signed the legislation that began to right the decades-old wrong. Graham was granted an honorable discharge for his Navy service, and all of his medals were restored, with one glaring exception, the Purple Heart. The medal for being wounded in combat was still out of reach. The fight wasn't over. His story got national attention in 1988 with the TV movie, Too Young the Hero, starring Rick Schroder as Calvin. The film brought a new wave of public support. That same year, President Ronald Reagan signed a bill that granted Graham full disability benefits for his injuries at Guadalcanal, finally acknowledging they were service-connected. The legislation also approved back pay, though due to lost records and the passage of time, he received only a fraction of what he was owed. Despite these victories, one piece of recognition remained missing. Shortly before he died, Graham told his nephew he was heartbroken that his Purple Heart had never been restored. It was the ultimate symbol of his sacrifice, and its absence was a constant reminder of the Navy's betrayal. Legacy and Final Justice Calvin Leon Graham died of heart failure on November 6, 1992. He was 62 years old. He had lived a hard life, shaped by a desperate act of childhood patriotism and the long, painful consequences that followed. He was buried at Laurel Land Memorial Park in Fort Worth, Texas. It seemed his final wish for full recognition would go unfulfilled. But his fight wasn't over. Even after his death, his widow, Mary, and his supporters kept pressing for that final piece of justice. Their persistence paid off. On June 21, 1994, nearly 2 years after his death and more than 50 years after the battle that earned it, Calvin Graham's Purple Heart was officially reinstated. In a ceremony in Arlington, Texas, the Secretary of the Navy presented the medal to his widow. At long last, America's youngest hero of World War II had all his honors restored. Calvin Graham's story is a profound and often uncomfortable reminder of the complexities of war. It's a story of incredible bravery and shocking neglect, of a boy who was old enough to be a hero but too young to be treated as one. He was one of thousands of underage boys who lied their way into service during the war, driven by a mix of patriotism, poverty, and a desire for a better life. Their often forgotten service highlights a desperate time when the nation, in its moment of greatest peril, turned to its children. His life forces us to ask tough questions about heroism, sacrifice, and a nation's duty to its warriors, no matter their age. Calvin Graham wasn't just a baby vet, he was a gunner, a rescuer, a survivor, and a fighter to the very end. His struggle for recognition ensures that his unbelievable story, and the story of others like him, will not be lost to history. The journey of Calvin Graham is one of the most remarkable and heartbreaking personal stories to come out of the Second World War. From a troubled childhood in Texas to the inferno of Guadalcanal, he lived a lifetime before he was even a teenager. His decades-long battle for the honor he had so clearly earned is a testament to his unbreakable spirit. What do you think drives a child to take such an extreme step? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of incredible courage moved you, please hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed for more unbelievable true stories from history. We'll see you next time. Stay curious.